Hi, this is David with Bauhaus and Helios RC. Today we're going to talk about first driving impressions of the all-new Axial SCX10 III.
We'll even do some drag racing.
If you haven't already checked out my video breaking down all of the new features of the 10.3, I'll include a link in the description below. Definitely encourage you to check that out, go through a lot of this new platform in detail. And before we get started talking about the driving impressions, just wanted to take a moment to encourage everybody. It's been a crazy time these last several weeks with the current public health situation. Want to let you know I hope everybody is staying safe right now, and just encourage everybody to follow the guidance from the federal, state, and local public health officials. They're trying to keep us all as safe as possible and help us get through this as quickly as we can with the minimal amount of harm, and so hoping that if we keep doing what we're doing, that we're going to be looking at this in the rearview mirror much sooner rather than later. So I hope you all stay healthy and just be smart and be safe out there. So with that said, let's talk about the 10.3. So what's it like to drive? Obviously, one of the biggest things that you notice right away is the ground clearance. The ground clearance is absolutely epic with these portal axles and the narrower wheelbase. This really does a great job of getting over roots, rocks, obstacles. It's really hard to get it hung up at the axles. And even at the skid plate, it's got enough of a ride height, the way it sits stock, that it does a great job over roots and rocks. One of the things I had questions about going in was how stable and well balanced the platform was going to be overall. When I put the body onto the stock chassis with the stock wheels, and this is yet again what it's like trying to get this thing. As you might know from watching my last video, that is my least favorite part about this new 10.3, is trying to get the body on and off. Anyway, so when I took it out for first drives in its fully stock form, I was very pleasantly surprised at how well this side hills. So one of the spots that you've probably seen from my other videos is this loose dirt side hill that's in our yard, and it's a really good test of both the balance and also the truck's ability to handle loose terrain as the suspension is getting unsettled. And the 10.3 did really well. I was very impressed. Did better on that side hill than a stock TRX4, stock Gen 8. Probably did as well as, maybe even a little bit better, but certainly at least as well as the stock 10.2, the original XJ kit, which I have over here. So very good job on the side hills. One area where I was a little bit less impressed was on steep climbs, and I think that's a result of a couple of things. One, and let me switch back and show you the platform that's got all the electronics installed. When you actually look at the layout of this new architecture, the battery is either going to sit on one of the side plates or it's going to sit back here, compared to the original 10.2 where your battery is going to sit all the way up front. This is the kit version with our forward motor conversion, but in either kit or RTR, your battery, which is your heaviest component, is going to sit up front. And so without that weight up front, the 10.3 had a little bit more difficulty on steep uphill than the original 10.2 did. Sort of reminded me a little bit of what it's like trying to drive the TRX4 and the Gen 8 up that same spot. So there are a few different ways to address that. One of the things that I've done already is on the kit version that I built, I included these Pitbull, the original 1.9 Rock Beasts in the compound with the new Crazy Crawler foams, which are really cool. And so the combination of the traction of the Pitbull tires, which is really good, and I think also the slightly lower overall height. These are 4.45 inches versus 4.74 inches on the stock tires, which brings the weight down a little bit. I think that those two things together helped get up the same loose and tree-rooted hill that I had a lot of difficulty getting up in stock, but I was able to get up on the version that I've just built out. Certainly things like adding a metal front bumper, adding a winch if you can add a winch, if you're the kind of person that likes adding additional weight, whether it's weight to the wheels or brass knuckles, brass portal covers, any of those things will help with that, adding a little bit more forward weight bias, which will in turn help the climbing ability of the stock platform. Let's talk about the tires. Overall, I thought that the trail grapplers that come with the kit did a nice job out of the box with no prep, no special cleaning, just take them straight out and start running them. They gripped pretty well, and certainly out of the box quite a bit better than the KO2s that were included on the original SCX10 II. The KO2s straight out of the box were actually quite slippery and tough to drive. After about 3 or 4 hours out on the trails, they woke up and they became pretty good tires. Seems like these trail grapplers that come with the 10.3 straight out of the box are about as good as the broken in KO2s from the 10.2. So I would expect that with some break-in these would get even better. But having said all of that, compared to the 1.9 Rock Beast straight out of the bag, the 1.9 Rock Beast definitely had more grip and did a better job. So stock tire is good, but you probably can find some that will work a little bit better for your application if you decide that that's the way that you want to go. Let's talk about suspension on this truck. This is one of the areas where out of the box I think the truck benefits the most from some tuning straight away. The kit includes 2 different spring rates for the shocks. There are a pair of green firm springs and a pair of red soft springs. Axial intends that the firmer green springs go up front, the softer red springs go in the rear. But because this truck doesn't have a whole lot of forward weight bias compared to some of the other trucks on the market, compared to the the original 10.2, that very firm, they call it firm, the firm green spring rate up front, even with no preload, the natural ride height for the truck is at full extension of the shocks, which already gives it some of that high ride height. In the rear, with that softer spring, you have to crank down the preload quite a bit in order to get the truck to ride approximately level, as opposed to having a pretty serious case of Carolina squat. So I felt like the spring rate choices were not the best given the out of the box setup. The other thing that I noticed is that there's a surprising amount of torque twist actually in the stock setup, and I wouldn't expect that given that already the original AR44 gear set has a lot of gear reduction at the pumpkin, and then there's added gear reduction in the portals, so there's a ton of gear reduction in the axles. Wasn't expecting to see that torque twist, but yet there it was. And so what I did when I built out my kit was I swapped the springs front and rear. So I actually put the softer red springs up front, and I put the firmer green springs in the back. And then I put I had a couple of leftover internal springs from the RC 4-wheel drive 70mm Ultimate Scale shocks that come with the Trailfinder 2. I do not like running internal springs on my leaf sprung trucks. The leafs are there to be the springs and the shocks are there to be the dampers. So those springs have no use in my world other than they happen to be the perfect size, the perfect, they have the perfect spring rate to stick around the shock shaft, underneath the piston, inside the shock body, and they basically what they do is they provide a little bit of resistance as the shock is reaching full extension. So they create a nice little semi-droop effect. And so you can actually see that even with no body on the chassis here, there is still some down travel to the suspension, and there's no body, no battery at the moment. Once you put the battery in, you put the body on, the ride height seems spot on. Torque twist is reduced a little bit. And one of the things that I wasn't expecting out of this setup was that the internal springs act as a bit of a sway bar. So as the truck is becoming unsettled, for example, on that same steep side hill that I take my trucks on when I'm testing them, the the starting point for the body and for the suspension, that uphill rear tire, or I should say the uphill rear side of the axle was not as heavily unloaded on the shock with this setup as it was with the stock setup, and so that back end stayed more stable as I continued to drive on that side hill, and as the truck got unsettled, as it was hitting different bumps and as it was slipping and sliding a little bit on the loose terrain. So overall, I really like the way that this performed. There are other ways to skin this cat. If playing around with spring rates, adding a sway bar, playing around with shock oil, obviously adding some accessories like metal bumpers, winch, and various other things are going to change the weight distribution versus the stock configuration. But overall, what I would say is just expect that the stock suspension setup, you're probably going to want to do some tweaking and tuning as you go. It's definitely an area that has room for improvement. One of the things that I've been getting asked about quite a bit is the powertrain, and in particular what types of motor ESC combinations with 2S versus 3S I might recommend based on the gearing of this new 10.3 platform. So I could talk all sorts of numbers, which I sort of did a little bit in the last video, but instead of that, let's look at some drag races, because that's going to be a really good way to show you how this stacks up to some of the other platforms that we're familiar with. Before we get to that, just so that you know, what I was running in these drag races is essentially a close to stock setup using a 16-turn 5-slot associated motor that they released in connection with the Element, so it's equivalent to a 35-turn brushed, running it on 3S with the 2-speed, so you'll see it in high and low. And I'm running the Pitbull Original Rock Beast, which is a 4.45-inch tire, which is smaller than the stock 4.74-inch tire. So if I were running the stock tires on this, it would be a little bit faster than shown in the video, but anyway, there you have it. So let's go, with that said, let's go straight to the videos. First up is the 10.3 against the TRX4 Bronco. High gear versus high gear. The TRX4 is running a brushed setup that is similar to stock, although using the whole top motor. You can see the TRX4 faster in high gear, but then low gear versus low gear, the 10.3 is actually faster than the TRX4. That just goes to show that the difference between high gear and low gear in the 10.3 is not as big a spread as it is in the TRX4. That's also one of the reasons why you can use a 540 cam brush motor in the 10.3, because you don't have that really tall top gear. Next up is the 10.3 running against a 10.2 running a Polar Pro stubby 3300 kV sensor brushless motor. Obviously the 10.3, even in high gear, is no match for the 10.2. It's the same story with the Red Cat Gen 8 running the same Polar Pro 3300, no surprises there. Next up is the 10.3 against the slowest vehicle in my entire garage, the Element Enduro, running a 35-turn silver can motor out of a 1.9 rate, and even on 3S, the Enduro is no match for the 10.3 in low gear, and of course, you won't be surprised to see that with the 10.3 in high gear, that looks even worse for the Enduro. Oh man, that is dreadful. Anyway, the Enduro needs more power, maybe one of these days. But that should give you a pretty good idea of how the 10.3 stacks up to some of these other platforms. In a nutshell, if you have a particular setup that you like in a 10.2 or an original SCX10, there's a good chance you're going to like that as a starting point in the 10.3. What you'll find is that high gear is a little bit taller than what you're used to. Low gear is definitely lower than what you're used to. That's a good starting point to work from there. In this particular case, I actually like this setup with the 16-turn 5-slot, which is equivalent to a 35-turn 3-slot. I probably will drop the pinion by a tooth just because the top gear has plenty of oomph to it, and the motor was getting just a slight bit warm. Not hot, nothing to be concerned about, but in my trail trucks, I really like to keep those motors nice and cool. So I'll probably drop it by a tooth and call that good. So hopefully that helps you with your motor and powertrain decisions on the 10.3. So to wrap this up, what do we think of the new 10.3? I really like it. I think Axial has done a very nice job updating the SCX10 platform. They have addressed a lot of the durability weak points, especially around the links and the shocks. They've added some nice new features, the scale drivetrain layout. And when you put it all together, this stacks up really well against what I consider to be the class leaders in this segment. Trucks like the TRX4, the SSD Trail King, the Vanquish VS410 Pro. When you compare what you get for the dollar with this truck versus what you get for the dollar with those other trucks, the 10.3 more than holds its own in this class. So if this is something that has intrigued you, if you've been keeping your eye on it, I would highly encourage you to go ahead and do it. I think you're going to love it. If you're not a kit guy or gal, the RTRs I'm sure are going to be not far behind, but overall Axial's done a great job, and I think you'd be very happy with yours. Thank you so much for watching. Happy trucking.